Gonna check this sound. We okay on this sound? Well, we should, yeah.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming out for Larry's session on Algeria and Morocco, and we'll see what he's going to enlighten us this morning about. So will you silence or turn off your cell phones, please? And as Charlie reminds us when he's the room host, that when you are speaking into the microphone, if you hold it right straight in front of you and talk into it, you'll hear your voice, but that's the way everybody else hears you. So, all right, so Larry, take it away.
Thank you, Kathleen. Well, welcome. We finally are getting into the 20th century. Covered 1,000 years, and it's been at least 4 weeks. But I just wanted to say you had to make a choice when we, especially choosing a topic where I'm assuming most people have very little pre-knowledge. So, and although I may be on chapter 2 and you're still in the introduction, still, I hope it's been worthwhile. Yeah. And I will actually have a list here, but maybe I'll wait till next week. A list of a couple of books and a whole bunch of YouTubes on various subjects. It doesn't make any sense to give you I'll give it to you, YouTube on paper. I'll send an email because then you can just click on the link instead of typing out 27 letters of the alphabet. So I'll put that on the forum. Okay, what did we do last time? We were still in Morocco, and remember we have this Alawite dynasty, not the same as the Alawites in Syria. That's easy to get that confused. This talks about Ali from the time of Muhammad. And in Morocco, the monarchy, as we'll see it again when we talk about post-independence, is the main symbol of Moroccan authenticity. The king is really very important. There he is now, King Mohammed VI. Once again, I'm always interested to see that traditional robe that is worn not all the time in Morocco, but certainly very often on official occasions. And remember, Abdelkrim in Algeria leads the fight against the French, and the Moroccans at that time were quite sympathetic to him and they gave him support, but they weren't able to do much. And you have this little Franco-Moroccan war. So even though it's about Algeria, there was this conflict between Morocco and France, and those dates are just some of the key battles. And then in 1859, there's a war between Spain and Morocco. All these countries, European countries, trying to control North Africa. And in the 1880s, there's this, I think we have a map here. Yeah, scramble for Africa. So if you look, all those colors suggest colonial powers. I mean, Africa is, quote, divided up into European control. Very few independent countries, Morocco being one, although it is increasingly under the influence of France and secondarily of Spain. And one of the ways in which they exert this control is what I've using the term from the Ottoman Empire, capitulations. That is, you owe money, and therefore, in order for the Moroccans to pay the money back, you give certain exemptions to local laws for all kinds of people. So more and more people, Europeans, are exempt from Moroccan law. That's what I mean by the capitulations. Then in the 20th century, remember, we're just reviewing from what last week. In the 20th century, the French declare a protectorate, and we talked about that's the protectorate. You see both Spanish and French. The French is the, let's do this. Here's the Spanish here. That's the Spanish protectorate, Spanish control over Western Sahara. But here's the French protectorate. Most of what we think of as Morocco. That was the French protectorate. And there's Léoté, great figure in France. As I mentioned, there's this equestrian statue that after independence, the French quickly moved it to the consulate to protect it from being toppled. And the Rif War, 1921 to 26, the Spanish were unable to exert their control until finally the French sent in an army. And it was a pretty vicious war. And the last thing we talked about were the Spanish generals in North Africa. They divided what they were called the Africanistas, those generals who were interested in maintaining Spanish control, and the Abandonistas. Well, you can see the word, to abandon. You know, the hell with it, we don't need to be there. And that was this conflict in the army. And this is the rise of Francisco Franco, who, well, Rick pointed out in the picture I showed, he was a colonel, but he very quickly rose to become the youngest general in the Spanish army, perhaps the youngest general in Europe. And when he led his forces that started what became the Spanish Civil War, most of those forces were Moroccans, Berbers. There's this, well, I didn't mention this, but if you remember, at least I did as a teenager, all the songs of the International Brigade, where they didn't mention any names, but it was clear that Pete Seeger's voice was sticking out in there. But one of the songs was talked up on the basis of an old Spanish folk song, O Manuela or O Carmela, and it's we fight against the Moors. It goes, luchamos contra los moros, rumba 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 la. Luchamos contra los moros, mercenarios y fascistas, ay Manuela. So against the Moors, the mercenaries, and the fascists. That was the message. And we don't have any time here, but we're also not a course of Spain, but it's a very tragic history in Spain. And there, at the end of the Civil War, these are the Moroccan soldiers who were still, they weren't the entire Spanish army, but they were a good chunk of it. Well, let's move on to France and Algeria. Algeria occupies the French national consciousness to today. I mean, there was a little scandal in France last week when Ségolène Royal, who was a socialist candidate for president against Macron, who is now president of the France-Algeria Friendship Society, visited Algeria and made some comments about French colonialism and possibly need for reparations. The YouTube influencers and French newspapers have gone crazy over denouncing Royal. That is, my point is that Algeria still occupies this place in French consciousness. Anyway, here's this map. These are French colonies pre-1945, and the colors suggest when they got independence. You know, and there was a big movement in the 50s. Here you have, or 1960, here's just all these countries in West Africa, Madagascar. And that big chunk there is Algeria. It's 1962, and what we're going to talk about today, it was not a peaceful transition. Here, the French were using Algeria. It's a fundraising poster addressed to Algeria, because the mainly Berbers, but also Arabs, were in the French army, World War I. And later on, it says International Colonial Exposition. There's 1931, huge, and we'll see in a minute, I have some more slides about that. But there it is again, 1931. And of course, the image there, they were all Africans, even though the empire includes lots of other ethnic groups, but very heavily African, as you see on the map over there, this whole big section of West Africa. Well, between the world wars, first of all, you start off with 170,000 Algerians served in the French army. You know, that they're fighting, quote, for the homeland in Europe. But at the same time, the majority of Muslims are excluded from political life unless they renounced Islamic personal law. That's this image we've had before, personal status. What is personal status? Who controls birth registration, marriage, divorce, inheritance? And French said that they want to impose French civil law if you're a Frenchman, and they don't even give, well, the Muslims are allowed to renounce Islamic law, but it's an issue that remains. It's a very significant issue. And these are just images of various people in Algerian life of the time. You know, women in traditional garb on the upper right. In the middle there, you have either, hesitate to call them Arabs or Berbers. Remember that Algeria has a very large Berber population, not the majority, but significant. So you really have two Algerias. At the time between the wars, about 800,000 colonists, or pieds noirs, Blackfeet, and it's not a derogatory term. They just mean, who knows where that term comes from. And there's 6 million Muslims who were subject to what is, in French it's called the indigénat. It's a law code that applies only to the non-Europeans. Or I was looking at a memoir of an Algerian nationalist, and when he wants to talk about the European population, he always has to say the Europeans and the Jews, who had yet a third legal system involved. We'll mention that again. We mentioned it before, and we'll mention it again in a couple of minutes. Oops. So in this period, the cities are expanding. You may be familiar with the names of the cities. Algiers is the capital, Oran and Constantine. But the Great Depression hits Algeria very hard. I threw that in, just another image of the interwar period. But before that depression hit, before the French realized they were in a depression, they had two big celebrations. The 1930 celebrations, 100 years of French Algeria. And in 1931, they had this international colonial exhibition for all of its colonies. So there's that image we saw a minute ago. But here, come visit the human zoo. I mean, they talked about this. And this is an advertisement. I'm going to translate what it says on that advertisement. exhibits for 8 million visitors to the Colonial Exhibition in Paris. On 10 hectares, which is about, what, 25 acres, France opens the largest human zoo ever created to justify colonization on the cover of a civilizing mission for the, quote, barbarians. The French have a colonial vocation, declares Paul Reynaud, who is the Minister of Colonies. Remember, they had this, and they talk about this civilizing mission, la mission civilisatrice. And this article goes on at a time of suffering from a general economic crisis. This is obviously a criticism. The exhibition also served to divert the French with a grand moment of national celebration, denounced by only a handful of people. But what they're saying, the colonial empire was already unsteady. Well, the French didn't know that, but there were lots of stirrings of desire for independence of various nationalisms all over Africa, and remember the large colonies in Southeast Asia.
Could you go back to the preceding slide?
This one?
Yeah. The whatever that thing is on the top right, the République Française, it almost looks like a poster.
Yes, I think it's a poster. Yes.
That looks like a celebration. See, to my 21st century training, that looks like a celebration of diversity. It's really quite beautiful, and they're all quite varied in their dress.
Well, everything is in context. If it's an international colonial exposition, come and see all these peoples who are part of French culture. And they, yes, I mean, it looks like natives. On the other hand, it's in pre-modern dress, if you will. You know, there's the famous joke about how you have this uniform educational system. So at any one point, from anywhere from Saigon to Timbuktu, the children are reciting, "Our ancestors, the Gauls."
Could I just... It must be about 20 years ago, but as some of you know, I have a brother who lives in Paris, so I get to visit Paris a lot. And I went to, there was another exhibition, and I believe it was on the site of that colonial exhibition, where it was a whole critique of colonialism. It was very interesting to see how they, in another era, the evils of colonialism were highlighted, and also the evils of, you know, the way the workers putting it up were treated and various other things. So they came around.
Yeah. That's a very interesting comment. And I must say, it's nice to hear that, but whenever you say that, you have to say, except for Algeria, as we'll see.
It's generally observed that the British left their colonies with the English language, public education, railroads, and a legal system to an extent. What did the French leave their colonies with other than the French language?
Well, it depended where. For example, Algeria and Morocco, there was a significant investment in infrastructure, in roads, and an attempt to bring in schools. In Indochina, as I understand, it was a pretty corrupt system. The French colonial officials made a lot of money with the, yeah.
How did the French get the Algerians to fight for them? You said they had...
Well, that's a real success. How did they get the Algerians or the Moroccans to believe what we today would find unbelievable? But they did. I mean, that's, so that notion of the civilizing mission did come across to them. We have, here we come, our French expert.
Actually, this is an American comment, but there's a very interesting poem by Langston Hughes, a poem by Langston Hughes, which is a poem to a Moor that he encounters when he's fighting in the Spanish Civil War and tries to speak to him, and the man can't speak his language, but he says, I wonder, you look like me, I wonder if you know what you're doing. It's a very good poem. I'll send it to you, Larry.
That's interesting, very interesting. But I like to, let's go on. I want to go on to the beginnings of Algerian nationalism. One of the people, I remember Ferhat Abbas was in the newspapers a lot in the late 50s and early 60s. He was considered one of the interwar moderates who was involved in this 1936 manifesto of the Algerian people. And what do they want? They're not talking about independence yet. They're talking about political equality, land reform. Remember, there's very uneven ownership of land, that the local Algerian landowners have been pushed out in favor of larger plantations, and the end of the indigénat, that separate law code. That's the demands from the mid-30s. And even in 1943, I didn't translate that, but Manifesto of the Algerian People, now they're talking about an autonomous Algeria linked to France with equal citizenship. And they wanted a sort of an internal constitutional assembly. The Free French, that means the Gaul, and they're not interested in any of that. I mean, the Free French want to free France from the Germans and reestablish their colonial empire. So that, remember, initially, when the Allies invaded Morocco and then Algeria, the army of Vichy France attacked them, but that was turned around, and then later on, de Gaulle sets up his headquarters in Algiers. But so the Free French are not interested in this stuff. And when you read about Indochina, the same thing happened in the 1919. Ho Chi Minh was, you don't want to hear anything from him. But anyway, in 55, we get this FLN, National Liberation Front. And Abbas becomes the first president of the provisional government of the Algerian Republic, president of the assembly. But it's not as though this is a unified movement. And what we're going to see now here, that there's a lot of vicious infighting. I mean, when you read about these revolutionary movements, they're not peaceable people, but in this case, they're not peaceable to each other either. And the FLN kicks him out in '63. They tried to write him out of the history books. He had been very much involved, Ferhat Abbas. And I just wanted to mention here, because we're Westerners, Albert Camus, who his first, I should not fame, but he was a journalist in Algeria. He is a Pied Noir. And his first big, well-known articles talked about poverty in Kabylia. Remember we said that's the area where all these revolutionaries come from? They still do. And he wrote a series of articles in 1939 while he was still living in Algeria about famine and abject living conditions. And I want to mention that because that's what Algeria is doing. Here's a picture of Camus. I had been alerted to the fact that salaries were insufficient. I didn't know that they were insulting when he did his homework. I had been told that the workday exceeded the legal limit. I didn't know it wasn't far from twice as long as the legal limit. I don't want to scream, Jose Laton, I'm not sure scream, but I don't want to get excited. But I'm forced to say here that the work regime in Kabylia is a regime of slavery. So those articles were pretty widespread. I mean, it made him well known. Not everybody liked what he said, but it was important. So the question that people have asked, is he attacking the colonial order? Or what he's saying, we got to make things better for the local population, and in some people's eyes, critical of Camus, say, oh, he's just a defender of the old order, just wants to tinker with it and make it better. This, you're always going to have this kind of back and forth criticism of critics of conditions. In the 1950s, Camus has a commitment to nonviolence. You may know there's a very well-known rupture between him and Jean-Paul Sartre. And they people saw them at least as allies and more likely as friends, but they split apart heavily on their idea of violence. And I don't want to spend time on Sartre, it's a whole another subject, but Camus had a kind of an ambiguous stance on Algerian nationalism because he was a pied noir. They were his family, they were his people. And he was essentially rejected by both the FLN and the pied noir. They didn't want a moderate voice. I'm going to move on from Camus to, just for an aside here, about Jews in Algeria, because they play a special role here. Remember, we talked about this decree of 1870 under the Minister of Justice, Adolphe Crémieux, which said that the Jews in Algeria receive a special legal situation, makes them equivalent of the Europeans, even though they are, quote, Algerians. Well, in this context, there is a context of anti-Semitism in France, the Dreyfus Affair of the 1890s. I assume you're aware, a French Jewish officer was framed, presumably because he was Jewish, and it really splits apart opinion in French society. In the interwar period, anti-Semitism becomes significant at the same time as you have in 1937 an attempt to, by the Prime Minister Blum, who happens to be Jewish, also adds to this controversy. Well, Crémieux was too, yeah. We talked about that the other day. The proposal was for a limited number of people to get political rights without renouncing the old personal status. The reason for mentioning this here is that the Jews from 1870 on had this special situation. When nationalism became more and more important, the Arab and Berber nationalists resented this very much, and there is a certain amount of anti-Semitism anyway, but it becomes really strong in this racialized nationalism. We're against the French, against those guys, and that means against the Jews. And after independence, you have a very large-scale immigration of Jews from Algeria, although they had played a role in Algerian culture, because there was a significant number of them, and we'll talk about them in the Exodus, Algerian Exodus, in a couple of minutes. Well, we often talk about the Algerian War of Independence, 1945 to 1962. Now, I'm not going to go into detail. There's a lot of detail available, but it becomes increasingly vicious on both sides, both the French and the Algerian side. Here is, on the upper right, it says the Party of the Algerian People. On the lower right, you see this military control that was so resented by the Algerians. And on the left, that's the flag, the Algerian flag. Well, a lot of the bad things started. I mean, we have to pick a date, May 8th, 1945. May 8th is VE Day, Victory in Europe. The same day, things happened that are often seen as the beginning of a mass movement for independence of Algeria, because it started with some demonstrations by Algerian nationalists in a couple of towns, Sétif, Gelma, Ketrata. Those are those places up top. I'll show them on a map in a second. And they attacked this. The Algerians attacked some French settlers, so some settlers were killed. Here you have these areas where these demonstrations took place. I'm trying to see. Here's Constantine, Algiers is over here. Well, what happens? That's an image of the massacre of Sétif that says there was a French reprisals. So the militia of the Pieds Noirs and they were both the army and these militias who were authorized, licensed by the authorities, go out and restrain these nationalists. And there's no respect for human life at all. That is, you have many people were killed. It depends who's estimating.
So who's in the militia? Are those?
The settlers.
Okay, so it
They're
really
local.
isn't totally racialized then.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Yes. I mean, they saw those attacks on settlers in 45 as being against all, let's call them Europeans. And anyway, how many people are killed? It depends. This always happens when you try to estimate. You know, the French lowball it and the nationalists highball it. But a lot of historians talk about as many as 17,000 people were killed. Riots. These are pogroms against local Berbers and Arabs. They have executions such as in this this picture here. Put a vicious picture, but it's not just that suggests there's a trial, but there were just plain out murders and killings. It was a very terrible time. And the Algerians, although they remember this, they didn't discuss this much until the 1990s because it was the wrong wing of the nationalist movement who was involved. I mean, it's really, you know, trying to control history. Well, you're reading 1984. Who controls history? One of the people who's really important, we talked about Farah Abbas as a moderate, but the really outstanding figure, at least for a while there, is a man named Masali Haj, who is considered the father of Algerian nationalism. He becomes very successful at his organizing. He, in 1926, he found something which later becomes the Party of the Algerian People, PPA, and then other organizations. He's a real charismatic leader, not a Democrat, but a real charismatic leader. And he demands the end of French colonial rule in Algeria, the end of the indigénat, that law code, the right to form trade unions, he's got this socialist outlook, education for all. Well, I should say he's not really interested in the Berbers. He is an Arab, and for him it's an Arab nationalist movement. He was under Vichy, you know, which is 1940. He's arrested, sentenced to 16 years at hard labor for his nationalist activities. But after World War II, he's released. And of course, he's still active. And the whole nationalist movement is split apart. You have the Massaliists, if I can call them that, and others. And they don't engage in just peaceful debate. I mean, they do at times shoot each other and kill each other. His assertion of Arabism alienated the Kabyles. Remember the Kabyles, this is this Berber homeland that has time and again given the origins of nationalist movements. It happened in 1830s, 1870s. The Kabylians are just unhappy with this kind of Arabism. I should mention, by the way, I saw YouTube the other day. Now, this was sponsored by the Israelis, but they had a guy who says, we want an independent Kabylian republic. He was a local Berber. It's still around. The Masalis were in competition with the FLN. And there was kind of internal war. We're not going to give a history of the war here. We'll mention a little bit more in a minute. There are massacres. The FLN, which emerges independent by the mid-1960s, gave no recognition to Masali until the 1990s. They just want to obliterate him from history. So when you do research on Algeria, it's still difficult to I don't read Arabic, but what I'm told is that it's still difficult to find materials in Arabic. I mean, there are some French scholars who try to bring some balance to what was going on. I mentioned one, Benjamin Starra, and I'll mention him again. But, you know, read them out of history, put it down the memory hole. The PPA, the precursor to the National Liberation Front of Algerians, versus the Berbers. And as I said, in Kabylia, there's a breeding ground for nationalists. And this down here suggests they're still speaking not Algerian Arabic, not French, but the Tamazight language. You know, there's no one language. There are a series of related dialects. But so this is just a suggestion of where the speakers are. And you get Algerian Algeria versus an Arab Muslim Algeria. So Masali himself said the Berbers were a virus, a colonialist creation. So, you know, he's just not willing to see that this is a legitimate expression of nationalism.
So I'm just not clear. The Algerian Algeria?
Meaning everybody, that all the Algerians should be together, that is to say, Berbers, Muslims, Jews, and possibly even French colonialists, versus an idea that Algeria should be an Arab Muslim state.
And Masali is in
Masali
favor
is this Arab Muslim Algeria.
state. Okay, thank you.
Even though in other respects, one consider him socially progressive, a kind of a socialist worker, agricultural labor message.
Sorry to be, I just don't know enough, and I'm going to ask a question that you could ignore. Could you explain the difference between the Berbers and the Arabs?
Well, what makes an ethnic group? Very often it's a combination of language and customs. The Berbers themselves have a tradition, a rural, often mountainous tradition with their own systems of often inheritance, marriage, and so on. And the Muslims have a Muslim tradition which differs in some ways. So an interpretation of the Sharia among the Arabs may well be different than among the Berbers, who, although they are also Muslims. I was just going to ask that. They are Muslims, so there's not a religious split here. What about language? I remember talking to someone here who had been a Peace Corps volunteer in Morocco, and not so different in one sense from Algeria. And I said, how well did you learn French? And he said, I didn't learn a word of French. I learned Moroccan Arabic, or in this case, could be Algerian Arabic. And his wife, who had been up in the mountains, did not speak either Arabic or French. She learned Tamazight, that is the local Berber language. So what makes languages hold groups together? It's not the only thing.
Do you think it's fair to say that Berbers think of themselves as the indigenous people of that region and the Arabs historically as the invaders?
I don't know enough to answer that question. I would say there's probably something to that, but the Arabs, of course, have been there for 13 centuries now, since the 7th century. So, and there are some intermarriages, and there are Berbers who speak French or Arabic, and the fact that so many Berbers went into the army, meaning that they were part of it. So I think there's probably some of that, especially when things get tough and they get rejected. But let's go on. Algeria, in the early 1950s, to the outsiders, seemed calm. There was plenty of turmoil in Morocco and in Tunisia. We're not even dealing with Tunisia in this course, just don't have time, and it's a smaller thing, but they have some of the same developments. And you have François Mitterrand, whose name you should recognize as president of France in the 1980s. The French presence will be maintained in this country. We have no intention of leaping into the unknown. This is the socialist minister who's saying this. Mitterrand has a funny background, but because he was involved with Vichy at first. But anyway, it's typical, this kind of comment. But I wanted to mention this here. This is not Algeria. This is French colonialism. If you recall, we're all old enough to remember, 1954, Bien Bien Phu is this major French defeat in Vietnam, Indochina. And I gave you this little map. This is here in the corner here. Tonkin is what we later called North Vietnam. Here's Dien Bien Phu. And there's a very significant French defeat. And this suggests the end of French colonialism in Vietnam. They start to pull out after that. It's when the Americans, unfortunately, start to pull in. And so we have a long history of that. But here's the Viet Minh troops planting their flag over the captured headquarters. It was a real disaster for the French. And so this is the atmosphere of, we have Algerian nationalism, and the French are reeling from this stuff going on. And we then have, in the 1950s, what the nationalists like to call the Battle of Algiers. And there's this cult film, as Rick reminded me yesterday, Pontecorvo, the director, which I didn't remember, but it's a real pro-Algerian film, but it also glorifies violence. You know, the idea was, I think there, and you get this maybe from Fritz Fanon, the theorist who lived in Algeria, violence is important. It raises the consciousness of your own people, and there is this notion that it makes the other side become violent, and therefore we can turn public opinion against them. So those things really did happen. So you have France starts to get involved in a vicious war of repression. I remember one book at the time, Torture, Cancer of Democracy. Torture became a common method that the French army used, really a vicious repression. But in '56, you get strikes to internationalize the cause. In '57, you have images of little kids coming into a cafe, delivering a package to someone. The kid walks out and the place blows up. I mean, they're using all kinds of, and sometimes the kid never leaves. It's okay to sacrifice women and children to get this message across. And I think in the Battle of Algiers, they show these women walking down the street, and all of a sudden they pull off their robes and they have machine guns underneath. They're really men, as opposed to the French army, which is also vicious, and it's like, well, we're seeing some of it in our society, but not these mass shootings. So the French army does a systematic combing of the city, and in fact they did infiltrate the FLN using torture. They did suppress in many ways the uprising in Algiers, and for a while there the French thought they were successful at defeating this uprising. Here you have just a standard image, the French soldiers going down the street against innocent Algerian people. It's the innocents are the ones who get hit when you have these just trying to arrest everybody who looks like anybody. And there's the top picture is the Battle of Algiers from the Algerian point of view, and from the bottom here are the heroic French soldiers fighting the Battle of Algiers. Well, in this campaign for independence, which started in 45, but in the late 50s really becomes vicious. You have lots of deaths, roundups, tortures, disappearances, and many Algerians become quite radicalized, and the only total rupture is possible. But remember, this doesn't mean everybody. There are a lot of people who would really like just to go about their lives and not get involved in this, particularly in rural areas, but also in urban areas, both Europeans and Arabs, Berbers, and Jews. The Pied Noir have a feeling of vulnerability, and many of them support the use of force and repressive measures by the army. I give you this picture. This goes back to 1899. These are the settlers coming. Remember, we said they came from, not just from France, came from Italy, Portugal, lots of from Malta, and the population is really of both settlers and Arab Berbers is expanding, one by natural growth and the other by immigration. And I mentioned here Sartre before, the French left, like Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir, see the Algerian struggle as a symbol of the fight against colonialism. They may denounce torture, but sometimes they say violence is necessary. That's where they set them off from Camus. The French right says we got to have military action. And Camus, as I mentioned, is a man in the middle. He makes a plea in the mid-50s for moderation. No one pays attention to him. And later on, he's killed in an automobile accident before the independence in 62. I think it was 1960 he was killed. So you get a progressive erosion of support for colonial control. That's why I showed you Dien Bien Phu, that the colonies, is it worth it to have this? There's just, have to get some people to agree that Algeria is a colony. Sets it apart from all the other French possessions. Here's the Algerian People's Party demonstrating. And then in 1958, we have a coup in Algiers, and they want to return de Gaulle to power. And in 58, de Gaulle in France is brought to power as president. He comes to Algiers and makes his famous speech. I have understood you. Here he is. I have understood you. Well, what does that mean, that he understood? The Pied Noir assume that he understands what they mean. As he says, in all of Algeria, they're only Frenchmen, and he doesn't mean Europeans, he means everybody here, with the same rights and the same obligations. They say that, but meanwhile they have this other legal code which is discriminatory and so on. And in his office, all the colonies of France, just about, all the colonies in the late 50s and early 60s are made independent, except Algeria. And even in 1959, you get the first use of the term self-determination. So here's the dismantling of the French Empire from 58 to 60. Here's all this French West Africa stuff. Here's Madagascar. Here's what becomes Vietnam. These are the South Pacific colonies, although they still have some control in the South Pacific. That's hasn't completely been withdrawn. Here's Guyana right there, which is still considered part of France. So it's not complete withdrawal from around the world, but almost complete. De Gaulle says these territories can decide, kind of a referendum. If you want to be independent, you can be independent. And they have this referendum, and in some cases, I think it was Guinea, says we want to be independent immediately. They cut off all aid. They try to punish them for that. At the same time, now we're going to go back to Algeria. I'm just talking about colonialism in general. You have the Pieds Noirs organize what's called the OAS, the secret army, secret armed organization. It's called the OAS, founded in 1961, and it is opposed to Algerian independence, and it's opposed to anything the French government does that in that regard. So they have bombings, assassinations. They killed over 2,000 people in 61, 62. They tried to assassinate de Gaulle several times. And their notion is l'Algérie est française, Algeria is French and will remain so. Well, in 61, the French are talking to the Algerian nationalists. It's in the air, there's a possibility of independence. And there is an attempted coup by 4 generals, April 61, an attempt to overthrow the French government. The first phase of this coup is to take control of the major Algerian cities. That's Algiers, Bonn, Constantine. It failed because the army commanders in 2 of the cities refused to participate. It's not as though nothing happened, but they didn't participate. And then the idea was to overthrow the French government. French government responds first by blocking all flights from Algeria to France. There was that example, remember, of the Spanish Civil War where Franco brings his troops across the Strait of Gibraltar, eventually leading to the overthrow of the Spanish government. They didn't want that to happen. De Gaulle goes on TV with a great speech to the soldiers. And what's interesting that this is 61. I guess the transistor is patented in 1956. So transistor radios just are spreading. The soldiers they can hear announcements on the radio that they weren't able to hear. Transistor's a portable radio, so this is widespread. Here, first of all, the 4 plotting generals marching, and then de Gaulle. He says, this power has an appearance, a quartet of retired generals. It has a reality, a group of officers, partisan, ambitious, and fanatical. This group and this quartet possess an expedient and limited knowledge of things, but they only see and understand the nation as they define it, and the world distorted by their delirium. And then he goes on, he says, their enterprise leads directly toward national disaster. French women, French men, help me. That is, defeat these guys who are trying to overthrow democracy in France. Well, the coup did not succeed, but at the same time, Algerian Muslims are still upset. And in 1961, remember there are a large number of Muslims living in France now. They go for employment. They've been there after the Second World War. Some of them have stayed. So there's this infamous demonstration that was a demonstration against curfew that only French Muslims were subjected to. It's not a curfew of everybody. And here's the peace in Algeria. They're marching. The police superintendent is a man named Maurice Papon. Some of you may recognize the name. He was the police superintendent of Paris at the time. His past was he was very much involved in the deportation of Jews under Vichy. And in 49 to 58, he had been a prefect of Constantine in Algeria. Well, they repressed that demonstration, really. I mean, they beat people, they killed some, they threw people into the river to drown. It was really a terrible experience of the people demonstrating here. And here's a picture of the Minister of the Interior on the left, Maurice Papon, police superintendent in the middle, and de Gaulle on the right. So, I mean, de Gaulle acquiesces in this. I'm not sure, he probably didn't order it, but he did not object here. And then here's a book later on, A Massacre of All Algerians in the Heart of Paris. And the state denies any responsibility for it until maybe 2012. And then in 2021, for the first time, Macron, the president, says this was an unforgivable crime. And here's on the left, commemoration of the massacre in 2021. They haven't forgotten. Here it is. And then here's Macron at a ceremony in a commemoration of that massacre. Evian, place in France, becomes the site of negotiations for independence. And they result in a referendum on Algerian self-determination. And you get these negotiations running into 1962. And Ferhat Abbas, whom I mentioned before, is still there. He hasn't been pushed out yet. And here are these headlines, the one on the right. At noon, ceasefire in Algeria. That was really celebrated in France. I mean, people saying, let's get rid of this, what's happening to us. And on the left, it's the March 18th, 1962, signing the Evian Accords, and it says the war in Algeria comes to an end. What are the provisions? A referendum in Algeria. Interests of France are guaranteed. They're interested in mining. They're looking for natural resources. Even today, Algeria is rich in gas and oil. And they want to test nuclear weapons down in the Sahara, which they do in the next couple of years. And they retained a naval base, some military airfields. 91% of the people vote in favor, in Algeria, vote in favor of independence. Here's a voting card. Do you want Algeria to become an independent state, cooperating with France under the conditions defined by the declarations of March 19, 1962? Oui, yes, no, and 91% say yes. And July 3rd, 1962, independence. What happens in the next 2 minutes? The Pieds Noirs are given the right to leave. Now, the Algerians think, well, maybe some people will leave. But the Pieds Noirs are scared. There are some attacks on Pieds Noirs by some mobs. I'll explain who the hierarchy are in a second. But there's a mass exodus in 62. Approximately 1 million people leave, including 100,000 Jews who were also, remember, going back to the Crimea Decree, they had been given a special legal status. They feel uneasy, and there have been pogroms in Algiers. And these are not, there are some rich people, But these are just plain, everyday people, working people, who just feel scared for their lives.
Where did they go?
They go to southern France. France had temporary camps and then tried to resettle them. And there are lots of Arabs, Berbers, and these Harki. They are given an inferior status. It continues the same way. The people are perceived as repatriated, although there was hostility toward them. They had problems with housing, jobs. A lot of them settled in southern France, and they still presumably form a big voting bloc for the far right. You know, the Front National, the National Front. It's a tradition of where they came from. It's resentment against the government. These pictures show tragic pictures. I mean, it was a very difficult time. All right, let me take another minute or two, and we'll mention this again next week. Who is an Alki? An Alki was an Algerian Berber or Muslim who worked for the French. And it covered a whole multitude of sins. There were some fighters. These guys were like the policemen, and they were really resented. But there were other people who, especially in the rural areas, if you're not for us, you're against us. And they become pressured into either supporting the French or the nationalist movements. And they number several 100,000 people. Here, they're parading in Paris in 1957, so they are definitely in part of the French military force. But a lot of other people. After independence, first there are riots, and then they killed up to, depending on the estimate, up to 50,000 people were killed as traitors to the revolution. So France tried to restrict their entry. Because, you know, even though they supported France before, we don't want them, but you have up to 100,000 people. They're confined to these temporary camps. The idea later, they set up these little villages or isolated areas. They don't want them organizing politically in any way. It's a continuation of discrimination. After the Second World War, the Muslim soldiers are not entitled to the same pensions as the French soldiers. In the 1960s, they don't get the same benefits. And there are now, well, a lot of it is novels, but people talking about their families, they still feel this rejection. They're called, as I say, repatriated Muslims at first. They abolished that status in 1968. But here's a book, Abandoned Soldiers. So the fate of the Alki is really a difficult one. People, their support for France is rewarded with real viciousness. That's about all we have time for. Oh yeah, there's the last comment. They're only recently acknowledged by the French state, and they're still a visible community, Algerians in France. Okay.
All right. Thank you, Larry.
So it's after 12. I'll be glad that you can come up and ask me questions afterwards. Be glad to talk about it. And we have one more session next week on what happens after independence.